On January 5th, 1997, Rosemary Pacente, a 64-year-old schoolteacher, was enjoying her day off, relaxing in her floor apartment in the Bronx, New York City, USA. Little did she know what was about to unfold. The following day, on January 6, 1997, a concerned neighbor noticed that the lights in Rosemary's apartment had been on continuously since the night before. Worried, the neighbor decided to check on her in the evening. What she found upon entering the apartment was a sight that would stay with her forever: the lifeless body of Rosemary Pacente lying in the kitchen. Shocked by the gruesome scene, the neighbor broke down in tears before alerting the authorities. The question remained: who could commit such a heinous act against a simple elderly schoolteacher? What could have been the motive behind this brutal murder? This tragic incident sheds light on the Bronx, a borough in New York City known for Co-op City, the largest cooperative-owned space in America, as well as landmarks like Yankee Stadium, the Bronx Zoo, and the New York Botanical Gardens. Despite its attractions, the Bronx has a darker side, being safer than only 14% of U.S. neighborhoods. The likelihood of falling victim to a violent crime in the Bronx is 1 in 128, making it a notably risky area. This grim reality brings us back to 1997, when Rosemary Pacente met a tragic end in her own home. Born on July 28, 1932, Rosemary led a private life, never marrying and residing alone in Co-op City for 25 years while working as a dedicated schoolteacher. Despite leading a rather monotonous life, she would occasionally venture out to spend time with a select few neighbors whom she had befriended in the building. However, on Sunday, January 5, 1997, the cold weather in the Bronx compelled Rosemary to stay indoors. As the night passed and Monday morning, January 6, 1997 arrived, Rosemary failed to show up at the school where she worked. Her phone rang incessantly in her apartment, disturbing the otherwise silent atmosphere, but there was no response. One of Rosemary's neighbors noticed something peculiar. The lights in her apartment had remained on throughout the night. Filled with worry, the neighbor decided to check on Rosemary and arrived at her apartment at 6:15 p.m. However, upon reaching Rosemary's door, an unsettling feeling washed over her as she noticed it was slightly ajar. With trepidation, she cautiously entered, taking small steps, fearful of what she might discover. Unfortunately, her worst fears were realized as she entered the kitchen and came face to face with Rosemary's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. Overwhelmed by the gruesome scene, she let out a horrified scream before regaining her composure. Without delay, she immediately informed the authorities, prompting the arrival of Detective George Wood and Sergeant Curtis Oates from the New York Police Department to investigate the crime scene. Rosemary's body was drenched in blood, with a 9-inch knife still embedded in her back as she lay face down. The detectives observed the numerous stab wounds, indicating a painfully brutal demise. Additionally, they noticed that her throat had been slit and identified defensive wounds on Rosemary's right hand, suggesting a struggle with her assailant. Outside the apartment, in the building's lobby, further evidence supported their initial theory. Bloodstains were discovered smeared along the wall adjacent to the elevator, yet no traces of blood were found inside the elevator itself. This led the detectives to search the building's staircase, where on the 10th floor they stumbled upon another trail of blood, further deepening the mystery. Detectives were of the belief that, amidst the struggle, Rosemary had managed to inflict a wound on her assailant. The blood discovered on the elevator wall and the staircase, located 13 floors below Rosemary's apartment, provided strong evidence that it belonged to the person responsible for her murder. Detectives concluded that the killer may have escaped the building by using the stairs. Although the bloodstains were significant in the investigation, they did not provide any clues as to the identity of the killer. Samples were collected and preserved for further testing and future use. Subsequently, an autopsy confirmed that Rosemary had been stabbed a total of 39 times, with 8 of the wounds located on her back. The knife, which was found lodged in her back, belonged to a set from her own kitchen. This led detectives to believe that Rosemary's murder was likely not premeditated. They theorized that the attacker initially did not intend to kill her when entering her apartment, but ultimately did so during the struggle. The missing items from the apartment suggested that robbery was the motive behind this tragic incident. A few days after the murder, a funeral was held for Rosemary at Granby Cemetery in Hartford County, Connecticut, USA. Her loved ones gathered to pay their respects as she was laid to rest. Despite the strong evidence and compelling theories, weeks and months passed without any new developments in the case. Detectives were struggling to come up with leads, leading the police department to eventually shift their focus to other cases, causing Rosemary's case to go cold. However, more than 2 years later, in May 1999, Detective Kevin Lawler from the New York Police Department was assigned to the cold case squad and given Rosemary's case. Upon reviewing the case, he devised a plan to move forward. With the assistance of Detective Mark Tebbins, the blood samples found at the crime scene were re-examined, resulting in the successful development of a DNA profile for Rosemary's killer. The DNA profile was submitted to the nationwide database of DNA profiles known as the Combined DNA Index System. 2 years later, on August 20, 2001, Detective Lawler received a call from the New York Police Department Crime Lab regarding Rosemary's case. A match was finally found through the Combined DNA Index System, identifying the person as Charles Jones, a 28-year-old individual. Detective Lawler wasted no time and conducted a thorough investigation. He conducted a background check on Jones and discovered intriguing information. Initially, Jones was not connected to Rosemary's murder. However, due to his imprisonment for a robbery and assault of another resident of Co-op City on August 13, 1998, he was required to provide a DNA sample before his release on August 10, 2001. When Jones's DNA profile was uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System on August 20, 2001, it matched the sample belonging to Rosemary's killer. Additionally, Jones lived in Co-op City just a few blocks away from Rosemary's apartment at the time of the murder. While this strengthened the case against Jones, it was still insufficient to charge him. Detective Lawler recognized that although the blood sample evidence placed Charles Jones in the building during the murder, it did not place him inside Rosemary's apartment where the crime occurred. This gap in evidence was crucial for the case. Determined to gather more information and stronger evidence, Detective Lawler and his team decided to confront Jones. They attempted to locate him through his parole officer, only to discover that he was not at home and that his family was providing cover for him. The detectives left a message for Jones, stating that they wanted to discuss an outstanding traffic violation with him. A few days later, Jones took the bait and arrived at the precinct to discuss the alleged traffic violation. Jones was soon to discover the true reason behind his summons for questioning, making the next steps crucial. The detectives aimed to establish a comfortable atmosphere before confronting him. After half an hour of treating Jones kindly, the detectives proceeded with the interrogation. Despite Jones appearing nervous, he remained steadfast, prompting the detectives to introduce some unsettling facts to undermine his confidence. They informed him that the blood found in Rosemary's apartment belonged to him, providing sufficient evidence to link him to her murder. Upon hearing this revelation, Jones altered his story. The approach did not seem to yield the desired results. Detective Lawler realized that more needed to be done to break Jones and elicit a clear confession. He walked over to his desk, retrieved an envelope, and extracted a series of photographs. Placing them on the table in front of Jones, the images depicted Rosemary's lifeless body lying cold on her kitchen floor. Detective Lawler believed that this visual evidence might compel Jones to admit his guilt, but he was mistaken. Despite numerous attempts to coax the truth out of him, tensions remained high, and the detectives refused to let him go. The interrogation persisted for another 8 hours until Jones finally succumbed. He chose to confess to the murder and struck a deal for a reduced sentence by offering a straight 8, which means he would serve only 8 years in prison in exchange for a full confession. At this point, Jones realized that there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. He understood that he had to accept responsibility and endure the consequences. Fortunately, Jones made a wise decision. Instead of contesting the accusations, he provided Detective Lawler with a comprehensive confession, hoping it would aid him during his sentencing. According to Jones, the entire incident was a misunderstanding. He maintained that Rosemary had attacked him first, and he had acted in self-defense. However, the detectives found something unsettling about this confession. Jones, who was 23 years old and nearly 6 feet tall at the time of the murder, claimed to have acted in self-defense against a 5'4" elderly woman. The story seemed implausible to the detectives, who were not convinced that Jones's actions were justified. Charles Jones was taken into custody on Friday, August 24, 2001, on charges of robbery and the murder of Rosemary Pacente. Jones was warned that if he chose to challenge the charges in court and was found guilty, he could face a lengthy trial and potentially the death penalty. On January 11, 2002, Jones pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter in the Bronx County Courthouse and received a 19-year prison sentence. The arrest of Charles Jones brought a sense of closure to the community, particularly to Rosemary's neighbors. Belinda Bailey, a close friend of Rosemary's, expressed relief that the mystery surrounding her friend's murder had finally been solved after nearly 4 years of anguish. The use of DNA technology by the detectives was crucial in solving the case and providing closure to Rosemary's loved ones. Moving forward, the detectives are committed to utilizing this technology to solve other cold cases and bring justice to victims and their families.
After leaving the school, an 11-year-old girl vanished from sight. This case has had numerous unexpected turns and strange facts for years, making it one of the most bizarre and mysterious in all of California. The story did not finish there either, even though it took 45 years to discover the truth. We will explain what happened to Linda O'Keefe in this video, as well as the reasons why this investigation has drawn interest from millions of people worldwide. Born in Newport Beach, California, USA, on May 24, 1962, Linda O'Keefe grew up in a large, close-knit family. Her mother worked as a seamstress, and her father was a machinist. Linda had 2 sisters, an older and a younger sister. Linda enjoyed drawing, playing the piano, and spending time in nature and with animals. On warm summer days, she took advantage of every opportunity to visit the beach, which was only 800 meters from her house. The girl was also a Girl Scout and went to summer school. Linda went there nearly every day in July 1973, when she was 11 years old. On July 6, instead of her usual bicycle ride to school, she was given a ride by a piano teacher who lived a short distance away from the O'Keefe family. Linda called her mother from the school phone when classes ended, which was around 1:30 p.m. She was asking to be picked up because she did not have her bicycle with her that day, but the mother told her to walk even though it was only a little over 2 kilometers from school to home because she did not want to be distracted from her work. After speaking with her mother, Linda was not in the mood to walk. She even cried, and the school secretary considered giving her a ride home, but the woman needed to go the opposite direction, so she abandoned the idea. Linda left the school, sat outside for a while, and then headed home. Her route should have taken no more than half an hour, but the girl was clearly late. Her mother did not give it much thought at first. She assumed Linda had gone out for a walk with her friends, but as the hours went by, her concerns grew. Her mother made the decision at 6 o'clock in the evening to call all the people she knew whose kids lived close by and might have gone out with her daughter, but none of them had seen Linda that day. The family made the decision to start looking after her father got home from work. They made their way through the entire neighborhood, even the one Linda was meant to take on her way home from school. When it got dark outside and they were still unable to locate the girl, the parents decided to call the police. At that point, they believed the girl had resented her mother for not picking her up and was purposefully staying away from home. After receiving a report about a missing girl, officers started their search. Her mother stayed at home and called dozens of people who might have had a chance to see Linda, while her father and older sister ventured out in 2 cars to comb the neighborhood once more. All night long, the search went on. Using search dogs and helicopters, police combed the parks and streets, but their findings were equivocal. More police officers had been sent to join the search by morning, and local newspapers had already begun to cover the massive operation surrounding the 11-year-old girl's disappearance. 9 kilometers from Linda's house at around 10:30 a.m., a bicyclist, her friend, and son were riding through a park. They went there in order to observe the local wildlife for the botanical circle. After dismounting, the father and the child rode toward the ditches in hopes of seeing frogs. But there was more waiting for them. The man moved closer after spotting something bright in the grass and realizing it was a human body that was half submerged in water. Upon reading in the morning paper about a girl's disappearance and the police's all-night search for her, he assumed the body belonged to her right away. The man and his friends quickly exited the park, hopped in their cars, and drove to the closest payphone to report their discovery. An officer who had participated in the search for Linda was encountered by them en route. After learning their story, the policeman reported it and went in the direction of the location. It did not take long for the investigators to identify the deceased as Linda O'Keefe. She was dressed in the identical clothes the girl had left for school, and her mother had made the outfit the girl was wearing. Her backpack was also lying next to her, but she did not have on any shoes, and they were not discovered close to the body. After investigating the crime scene, detectives discovered tire tracks next to the body's location, but no other clues. The cause of death was determined by medical examiners to be strangulation. It was concluded that the death happened between 2 a.m. and 11 p.m. Investigators deduced that Linda had most likely been kidnapped not long after she had left school, meaning that her abductor had likely held her captive for roughly 12 hours. In addition to being abused, the victim's body had DNA traces discovered by experts. Since DNA analysis had not yet been done in those years, they were given to the laboratory for safekeeping. After failing to find any solid leads, the investigators started searching for witnesses. Interviews were conducted with all of Linda's friends, school staff, and the people who lived on the streets where the girl was meant to walk home. It soon produced results. The girl's friends saw her on her way home from school and noticed something off. Linda was walking down the road when a turquoise van approached her, slowed down, and continued to drive alongside the girl, but her friend did not see anything else because Linda and the van vanished from her field of vision. Almost instantly, police were able to locate 2 additional witnesses. The 19-year-old girl and her mother were driving the car about 100 yards from Linda's school when they noticed the girl speaking with the driver of the turquoise van that had stopped next to her. At approximately 1:15 p.m., the witnesses, who were familiar with the O'Keefe family from their neighborhood, were shocked to see Linda chatting with an adult male on the street and decided to observe what was happening. Linda was standing directly in front of the van with its passenger door open. The girl entered the car at some point while she was reportedly conversing with the driver. The witnesses chose not to pay much attention to the van as it drove off shortly after. Since they were positive the girl would never get into a car with a stranger, they assumed Linda had been picked up by a relative or acquaintance. Investigators were able to get a rough description of the driver after questioning the girl and her mother. He was a white man, about 24 or 30 years old, with an elongated face and blonde, curly hair. Regretfully, the women were unable to recall the car's manufacturer or even the license plate number. Nevertheless, the 2 women's story was the only strong lead in the case, so based on what these witnesses had to say, investigators assembled an APB on the suspect and his vehicle. They were dispersed throughout California, but to no avail. The investigator had a few more conversations with the woman in the hopes that she would remember some more information. They even accepted an offer to undergo a hypnosis session at one point. It was only partially successful. The witnesses could remember a few more details about the suspect's vehicle, but they were all too little to lead to the murderer's location. The police soon located a second witness. Around 10:30 p.m., a neighbor who lived close to the scene of Linda's death heard a woman screaming. At first, she thought she heard someone yell, "Stop hurting me," but the voice ended suddenly. The witness might have heard it because the girl passed away at the same time. Later that morning, the detectives got another intriguing tip. This one concerned Linda's body. It was in that park that the artist was working on his painting. He started to watch what was happening and realized that something serious had happened when he noticed dozens of police cars. He once saw something that seemed strange to him. There was a young man in the park, observing from the bushes next to the police. The artist chose to ask him what was going on because he was standing fairly close to him. The young man said the police had located the girl's body, and he looked very concerned. Aside from that, neither the man nor the artist could see any details because they were sufficiently far from the scene of the body's discovery. How the man knew that they were looking at the body of a girl was a reasonable question for the detectives to ask. The man was characterized by the artist as a thin white man with sideburns and blonde hair who was between the ages of 18 and 24. He stood at 180 centimeters tall. When the two witnesses described the van driver's appearance to the police, this description came pretty close. Investigators came to the conclusion that this man was the murderer as a result that he had decided to observe the police that morning. Finding the killer in the large city proved to be quite difficult, despite the police possessing a fairly detailed description of his appearance. But then something unexpected occurred 2 days later. They were approached by 18-year-old Peter Wooden, who admitted to the killing. The young man went to the same school as Cindy, the victim's elder sister, and lived close to the O'Keefe family. The town's residents were shocked when the news quickly spread throughout it. Police questioned the boy for 7 hours and searched his parents' house, not anticipating such unexpected developments. Following that, he was formally accused of murder. After 3 days, everyone was in for another shocking turn of events. Peter was declared free by the investigators after being exonerated of all charges. They claimed that the young man's confession contained far too many falsehoods and that the only times his story lined up with information that was published in the media were by coincidence. If not, he purposefully provided the investigators with false testimony that went against the actual evidence. Finally, the two witnesses who had seen Linda with the driver of the van were positive it was not Peter. Since they both lived close to the young man, the women knew him well and could recognize him right away. Consequently, the police deduced that the young man was merely attempting to make a name for himself by admitting to the crime of someone else. The man may have suffered from mental health issues, but he was unrelated to the murder. The investigators were left without a single good lead after that. They continued searching the entire town for the van and its driver, even enlisting the help of Linda's classmates. Children searched for that same turquoise van on their bikes while riding through the streets, despite police protests, but they were unable to locate it. Police interviewed 175 people during the first month of the investigation, searched every inch of the route from the school to the home, and requested assistance from the general public. They chose to make public a crude drawing of the van's driver a few weeks later, but that move also failed to produce any results. Detectives were not sure whether to pursue this at first because they thought the man would leave town, but as time went on, they needed to employ more and more resources in order to crack the case. The police had a new lead after 2 months. In the same neighborhood, there had been abuse of another girl. After dragging her into his van and taking her to a desolate location, an unidentified man released her. Despite discrepancies, investigators surmised right away that Linda's killer might have been responsible for the murder. The attacker's description of his appearance did not correspond with the information supplied by the witnesses in Linda's case, and he drove a white van. The detectives soon had a lead on the suspect. The truck driver, who was 32 years old, was found to be guilty. Investigators came to the conclusion that this man had nothing to do with Linda's murder because witnesses claimed he did not resemble the man Linda was speaking to at all. Although investigators have continued to work on the case over the years, no noteworthy evidence has turned up since then. Authorities sent DNA samples from Linda's body to a lab in 2001, 28 years after the murder, in the hopes of obtaining a profile of the killer's DNA. However, the man was not included in the FBI database. This suggested that either it happened before they began collecting DNA from offenders or the murderer had not been charged in any prior criminal cases. Experts attempted, but were unsuccessful, to locate his next of kin in that database a few years later. However, the tools available for DNA analysis were far from what they are today, making it nearly impossible to do something similar in those years. Around the middle of 2010, there was a breakthrough in the field of forensics, which gave the police new tools for locating suspects. Not to be left behind, investigators in Linda's case also turned to a private lab known as Parabon in 2018. They sent detectives a picture of a man created using Linda's murderer's DNA. DNA phenotyping is an innovative technology that enables you to identify various physical characteristics of an individual based only on a small sample of their DNA. Experts assembled two portraits at the same time, implying the perpetrator's possible ages of 20 or 60. This portrait was surprisingly accurate to the testimonies of witnesses who had 45 years earlier seen the suspect alive. Investigators in Linda's case did something no one had ever done before. In most cases, they would contact people who may have known the man and publish portraits of him in the media to garner public attention. Exactly 45 years after the murder, on July 6, 2018, they shared a string of messages on Twitter on behalf of the victim. The final day of Linda's life was detailed in the sequence of 68 messages. The way the investigators presented this data made it seem as though she was telling the public directly what had happened to her on July 6, 1973. The story started in the morning with Linda narrating her day at school, her anger toward her mother for not picking her up in the car, and the girls' walk home. Detectives have meticulously chosen every detail from these messages to create the most accurate picture of the day. The last tweet in the series informs followers that there has been no progress in finding her killer. In response, the police have released a picture of the offender on the girl's behalf. 45 years later, I am able to talk again, and I have to tell you something important. The killer's face, which was found through the use of his DNA, is a new lead in my case. This technology did not exist in 1973, but it can now change everything. This strategy attracted a great deal of attention to Linda's case right away, all over the world. Police had previously posted details about past unresolved cases on social media, but a victim's account was unique. The murderer's own portrait served no purpose. The investigators needed to get as much attention as they could for these photos because if someone identified the subject and informed the police, it would only aid in the case's resolution. They did a fantastic job at that. Over 7 million people saw this series of tweets in total. Detectives spent several months investigating the numerous tips and potential identities of the perpetrator that the police received, but they were never able to identify a credible suspect. They were not going to give up in the face of this, especially since Linda's case had attracted millions of attention. Once more, the investigators turned to Parabon, this time requesting that they attempt to use the killer's DNA to identify his relatives. While comparable efforts by forensic scientists have been made in the early 2000s, the required instruments were non-existent at the time. After nearly 20 years, things have changed. Investigators were able to identify the culprit thanks to the Parabon experts' successful search for relatives of the DNA's owner. The search for Linda's murderer started in August 2018, and it took investigators nearly 6 months to find any leads. They located the killer's third cousin by using private DNA databases. That essentially meant that detectives were one step closer to cracking the case. All they needed to do was look up the man's family tree and identify a suspect, but the Parabon experts did not stop looking until they made an unexpected finding. In one of the private databases, they discovered the murderer's personal DNA. He had willingly submitted his sample to a database where they could look up long-lost or distant ancestors. Later on, it was discovered that the man had received the unique genetic kit required to access the database from a member of his family. Police finally knew the identity of the murderer, James Allen Neal, 45 years later. Detectives visited the 72-year-old man who was living in a different state in January 2019. A private database would not have the credibility the court required, so they had to obtain a sample of the suspect's DNA before they could make an arrest. Police installed surveillance on Neal's property on January 29 and made arrangements with a garbage company to receive anything the suspect threw out. Following the acquisition of multiple items from which specialists could extract the DNA sample, detectives dispatched them to the laboratory and stayed in close observation of James over the following 3 days. Sadly, Forensics was unable to obtain a sample of the man's DNA, so the investigators had to look elsewhere for evidence. They soon got the chance. The police promptly gathered the evidence after observing the suspect smoking while seated in his car in the parking lot. He then threw the butt of his cigarette on the sidewalk before driving off. This time, scientists were able to take a DNA sample, and it precisely matched the murderer's DNA that was discovered on Linda's body. This implied that the culprit for whom they had been looking for nearly 50 years was James Needle. A few days later, detectives called a press conference to finally announce the suspect James Neal's arrest. James Neal was born in Chicago in 1946, and his family later relocated to California. His aggressive behavior was a result of his parents' frequent beatings, humiliations, and acts of violence against him. He started committing small-time crimes as a teenager at a young age, such as breaking into people's homes. Following that, he left school and made an effort to find employment, but he never stayed put for longer than a few months at a time. The man turned out to have a lengthy criminal past. He was arrested over a dozen times for theft, car theft, and robbery, among other offenses. Almost each time, he was released with little punishment and returned to his previous ways. James got married for the first time at the age of 25, and the two made their home in the Los Angeles suburbs. 2 years after they moved in, he killed Linda, and their house was a half-hour's drive from the city where she lived. The perpetrator was on probation for less serious crimes in another state at the time, and James' wife was expecting. Following that, he received numerous citations for theft and forging bank checks. He also briefly served time in jail for breaking the terms of his probation. James was apprehended by the authorities 3 more times for moving infractions after being released from prison. He divorced his first wife, with whom they had 2 daughters. He lived in different states for a while, but then returned to Colorado and married another woman in 1997. She had a child from her first marriage, and soon she and James had a daughter. Detectives who looked into the man's background discovered that although he may have been involved in numerous cases of child abuse, he was never prosecuted for his crimes. Neal approached 2 girls in his car and abducted them in 1995 and 2004. After mistreating them, he let them go. James remained free because he was never found guilty in either case. He was later suspected by police of at least 5 other similar incidents involving the kidnapping of girls from the street by an unidentified man in a car. A girl who attended James' church in 2010 lodged a complaint against him. She acknowledged that she had been molested for months by the man, who was 63 years old at the time. Neal admitted after all the victims reported multiple instances that were similar. All that followed was an inexplicable event. In some way, the victim withdrew her accusations, the case was quietly dropped, and the man avoided punishment. James went back to living his life as usual, staying out of the police's notice for the following 9 years until his arrest for Linda's murder. When asked if he had ever kidnapped the girls, the man denied any involvement. He claimed to have never seen Linda when shown a picture of her, saying that she reminded him of one of his daughters. In any case, the court ought to have found the suspect guilty because it was evident that his DNA was on the victim's body. Still, detectives made every effort to gather as much information as they could. They searched for evidence that James owned a turquoise van, but they were unable to locate any. But this was clarified very quickly. He worked in an apartment building and had access to the service van at the time of Linda's murder. Investigators discovered multiple hard drives containing the illicit materials when searching his house. On his smartphone, there were also comparable images and videos. On his computer, there was also something intriguing. It transpired that James had researched the past of violent offenders apprehended via DNA testing. It seems that he was fully aware that the police could use DNA to connect him to a number of crimes. For the detectives, there was still another unexpected finding. James had Linda's name tattooed on his wrist following his examination prior to being placed in a cell. Investigators believed that he had done so as a memento of his victim. But as it happened, it was a strange coincidence. The tattoo was obtained by James a long time prior to the murder, and the police verified this. The trial was scheduled to begin in February 2020, a year after the arrest, but the pandemic caused it to be postponed. Although James persisted in claiming his innocence, investigators were convinced that he was the one who killed Linda. But a trial was never held in this case. James was hospitalized in May and passed away from lung cancer 2 days later. Prior to his arrest, he was unaware of this illness, and by the time it was discovered, it was too late to start treatment. And so, the 50-year-old case was finally closed. Investigators plan to continue looking into the possibility that James may have had numerous other victims. Linda's parents died before the culprit was apprehended by the authorities. Her mother, who declined to pick up the girl from school, blamed herself for everything that had happened to her during her life. Linda's sisters expressed their gratitude to the investigators for their perseverance and determination in solving the case. Their parents' passing before this day was the only thing they regretted.